most people are disengaged, actively disengaged at work. We've all experienced that. We've all sort of experienced the pain that many people sense of working in large organizations. And by the way, this is not only true of corporations, it's true of hospitals, it's true of schools, it's true of non-governmental agencies, of non-profits. There's just this widespread disillusionment somehow with work and management. And I happen to think that this is actually an indication that we're at the end of something and that we can be hopeful that something new is emerging. Humanity has gone through a number of great historical periods. For some reason, humanity doesn't evolve linearly, but humanity makes these sudden leaps. And I believe that we're just about to witness the emergence of a fifth one. The very first organization started appearing around 10,000 years ago when we switched to the tribal age, when we went from basically small bands of a few hundred people to the first chiefdoms. And this is the period where meaningful division of labor was invented. These kind of very crude, sort of informal, violent forms of organizations are still around today in some areas, in the mafias, the street gangs, the militias in civil war countries. Organizations that were invented when we shifted to the age of industry is again a whole different metaphor. Organizations are no longer wolf packs. Organizations are no longer armies. Actually, a good organization is like a good machine. And this is still the predominant mental model that I would argue most leaders, most CEOs in organizations have today. You know, in an information age where most of the value comes from what is in our heads, we can't treat people like cogs. And so we have to make it an environment where everybody feels like they can contribute, like they're a member of the family. And so this brings the question of, you know, what's next? We all sense that we've kind of exhausted the current models. And I've been researching over the last 4 years a number of really spectacular organizations who are already in very large parts operating from the next model. So much so that Buurtzorg, that started 7 years ago with, or 8 years ago now, with 4 nurses, is now 9,000 people. They employ more than 80% of all the neighborhood nurses in the Netherlands. So they've basically gone from 0 to 80% market share. And so a nurse with Buurtzorg will sit down with a patient and drink coffee and have a real deep, heartfelt conversation about where are you at in your life? What can you still do? What can't you do? How could we help you regain some autonomy? And the medical results are spectacular because they know the patient so intimately. They drastically reduce the number of emergency hospital intakes. And the financial results are absolutely spectacular. The interesting thing is that there's been a number of studies done by the likes of Ernst & Young and other organizations about Buurtzorg. And what they found is that Buurtzorg uses less than 40% of the hours that doctors prescribe because patients become autonomous so quickly. This new model comes again with a number of breakthroughs compared to these machine or family type of organization. And there are 3 breakthroughs, the first of which is self-management. So within Buurtzorg, with 9,000 people, you don't have a single boss in a traditional sense. You don't have a single boss-subordinate relationship. The second breakthrough has to do with wholeness. This notion that we can actually be fully ourselves at work. There's something in most organizations that pushes people to show up in very particular ways in sort of a professionally acceptable way. And often, you know, we've worn this professional mask for so long that we kind of even forget that we wear that mask. We tend to identify with who we are at work. When we show up only with this very narrow part of ourselves, we also show up with only a very small part of our creativity, of our energy, of our passion. And so what they've put in place is a great number of practices to help us show up in the full glory of ourselves, to kind of open up that window, to help us show up with all of our longings, our hopes, our strengths, our weaknesses, our doubts, our successes. And what happens then is extraordinary. There is a level of vibrancy, a level of energy in these organizations that is simply astounding. And the third breakthrough is one that one of these organizations calls evolutionary purpose. Founders of these organizations say, we don't believe in this paradigm where the role of leadership is to have a vision, a strategy, and then do execution. We actually believe that the organization isn't a machine that needs to be programmed. We believe that the organization is a living entity, a living body that has its own sense of direction, that has its own energy, that has its own thing it wants to manifest in the world. And so our role as leadership is simply to listen to where does a system naturally wants to go. So for instance, none of these 12 organizations that I researched that are incredibly successful, none of them has a strategy document. None of them has a 3-year strategy. Almost none of them have budgets. They have a very clear sense of where they want to go, but then they have other practices to constantly listen to how is the world changing and how do we get there. None of these organizations has targets. They have salespeople without targets. It sounds totally crazy, but they have the results to prove it. Like if people are powerful because there's no hierarchy stifling them, they can take all the decisions they want. They can show up in the full glory of who they are, and they serve a noble purpose. Man, most of these organizations find they need to slow people down and make sure that people don't work too much. They don't need targets to make them run.